what business to be in, how to enter, and when to exit. These are the corporate strategy questions, the classic corporate strategy question. The second question that we often ask our students to think about is how to compete in the selected product market. That's the competitive strategy of the firm. And we have been doing a lot of this. This is where Porter comes in. So we're all very familiar with this. However, there is a third fundamental question that became more relevant with the advent of the internet and advances in communication technologies, and that is how to conduct business in selected product markets. And that's the business model of the firm. Namely, it is the activity system that depicts the architecture of the firm, namely how it conducts its business. What are the activities? How are they sequenced? Who does what? Some are done by the firm, some are done external to the firm. So there are many companies who create and capture enormous value, not just through the product and services, but also through the business model. Think eBay, think Nespresso, think Priceline, think Walmart. There are many other such firms that have developed innovative business model, and the business model in and of itself is a source of value creation and value capture. So today we are focusing on teaching and some research on how to teach business model innovation, because we have taught corporate strategy for a long time. We have taught competitive strategy for a long time, but we haven't been focusing specifically in our course as an element in a course or a course, a standalone course, such as the one I teach at the Wharton School and others, on business model innovation. So we are going to focus on building on research that has been done for a long time. Chris and I have worked in this area for at least 20 years, and we'll focus on the design and implementation of business model innovation and how to teach that for undergraduates, for MBA students, for executive MBA students, and for short executive program. So each of our speakers will offer distinctive yet complementary insights into teaching methodologies and techniques of business model design, of teaching business model design and implementation. Our speakers will discuss their experiences, their challenges, and how they manage those challenges. So our objective today is to provide a coherent perspective on business model innovation teaching and research, and offer new insights to guide future course development and academic inquiry. We will offer tips, techniques, and tools, and share experiences on best practices and rigorous methods for teaching business model innovation. With respect to the format, what you can expect. So there are two parts to our PDW. The first part will use a fireside chat format, as much as we can do that using Zoom. So we will speak, the speakers will be interviewed. Each of the speakers will be interviewed. Many of you have submitted questions in advance. Thank you. That was very helpful and very important, because the speakers have made a conscientious effort to focus on your questions in the context of their remarks. So some of the questions will be addressed through the remarks. The order in which we're going to go is that Julia will start by interviewing Kostas. I will then interview Julia. Then Julia is going to interview Chris, and then we'll take a break, a 10-minute break. Then I'm going to interview Kathy Eisenhardt. Then the second part is devoted 100% to your questions. Now, how do you ask a question? You type it into the chat line. You see in the bottom of your screen, you have chat. I will see that, and I will call on you, and then you will unmute yourself and you can ask the question in front of everyone. Another alternative, if you have a clarifying question during a particular interview, you can raise your hand. I will see that on my screen, and I will immediately call on you to get your clarifying question addressed during the interview. So we look forward to an interactive session. We welcome your question. We welcome your ideas. And I think as a community, we learn with each other and from each other. And with no further ado, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Julia to start interviewing Kostas. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rafi, and thank you for everyone for coming and joining this this interesting community. So we have 86 participants right now, so that's great. Thank you for people in Europe for whom this is a normal time, and for people in US, which is a more problematic time, and Canada as well. I see many familiar faces here. So thanks again for coming. And without further ado, I'm happy to interview Kostas. So I don't have to present Kostas to most of you. He has been actively researching and teaching business models and business model innovation at London Business School. And he's a great participant as well in many of our business model sessions prior to this. So I will start with a question submitted by one of the participants here. So if business model innovation is the primary learning objective, so if you have a course organized around business model innovation and you run it for a semester, what are some of the examples of underlying knowledge, topics, and skill sets that you can teach on a week-to-week basis? So Kostas, I let you.
All right, thank you, Julia. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm coming to you from beautiful Switzerland. I'm here on holiday. And the beautiful painting you see behind me, it's not mine. It's probably a very expensive painting because I'm staying in a very, very exclusive hotel here in St. Moritz. So this is not my painting and this is not my room here. But anyway, so it's a pleasure to be here with you. So Julia, what I plan to do is maybe describe a little bit the knowledge topics that I cover through my own course on business model innovation. And please feel free to interrupt me at any point and ask for elaboration or clarification. So for me, business model innovation, you could approach it from the perspective of the innovator, which is usually a startup firm. I mean, let's face it, the majority of new business models tend to be introduced by startup firms. So you could approach the phenomenon and teach it from the perspective of the innovator and ask questions like how do they come up with the business model? How do they design it? How do they implement it? How do they scale it up? And things like that. Or you can take the perspective of an established firm who faces the invasion of a new business model into their industry. And I have to say that my perspective over the last 15 years that I've been teaching this phenomenon, it has been from the perspective of the established firm that doesn't usually discover the new business model, yet has to face a variety of issues related to business model innovation. So if I could just very quickly summarize what kind of issues or knowledge I try to teach my students. And by students, can I just say, I don't teach undergraduates who don't have undergraduate at London Business School. I teach MBAs, executive MBAs, and then I teach in the executive education department of London Business School for the short open program. So it could be executives, mid-range executives to senior executives. So that's the people I teach. I have no experience in teaching this to undergraduates, but I suspect that the topics and the methods that I use to teach the MBAs are equally applicable to undergraduates. I don't see a reason why I could change that, but we could discuss that. So can I just say, the way I structure my teaching is it's around questions. Every session is trying to answer a question for the students. So the first question we start is, what is the phenomenon? What is business model innovation? I mean, so that gets us into issues of what is a business model as opposed to what is a strategy, what are the elements of a business model, how you design the elements of the business model. So how do you know that it's a new business model? Because remember, the phenomenon is business model innovation. Well, innovation relative to what? It could be a new business model for the firm, or a new business model for the industry, or a new business model for the world. And in fact, the most interesting business models that we could teach about are the ones that are new to the world. That's why you all teach about the eBays of the world and, Nucor or Airbnb and things like that. They are new to the world business models. So first session is, what is the phenomenon? The second session that I talk a lot about is it a new phenomenon? Why are we spending a whole course on this issue of business model innovation? And I think for you to appreciate why this is interesting, all you need to think about is that we had business model innovation 100 years ago. It's not like all of a sudden we woke up in the last 10, 15 years and we have business model innovation. I mean, IKEA is a new business model that arose in the 1950s. Nucor is a new business model in the steel business that emerged in the 1960s. Dell is a new business model in the PC business that emerged in the 1970s. EasyJet is a new business model that emerged in the 1990s. So we had new business models before, but it's only in the last 10, 15 years that all of a sudden, all of us got very excited about this phenomenon, and we started teaching it and started developing sessions at the Academy of Management or at the SMS talking about it. Why? Why is it that all of a sudden? I think I can answer that question if you want, Julia. This is what I meant. But I mean, I have a whole session trying to show how the technologies of the internet era have allowed for the emergence of a plethora of new business models that we couldn't have 20, 30, 40 years ago. Yes, we had business model innovation in the 1950s, but we used to get 1 or 2 every year. Now, with the new technologies and the internet, we get 1 or 2 every minute. I don't know of any industry that doesn't have a variety of, for example, the platform business model, the online platform business model. It's a new business model that became available because of the internet and the technologies of the internet. Can I just say the platform business model is not new. Any department store in any major city is a platform business model. If you come to London and you go to Harrods or you go to Selfridges, that is a platform business model. It brings together consumers with suppliers in a physical location and so on. But the internet allowed the online platform business model, or the use of AI to develop business models and so on. So my second session that I spend a lot of time talking about is this a new phenomenon, and why are we talking about it right now? The third session is then I get into what are the characteristics of new business models that makes it interesting as a phenomenon, okay? And the things that I talk about, for example, have to do with the fact that when new business models first arrive, they usually become interesting to different customers from the customers of the established players. This is the Clay Christensen original idea from the innovator's dilemma and so on. Or the new business models conflict with the established business models. By conflict, I mean things like they may cannibalize. Rafi mentioned the Nespresso business model. The Nespresso business model was introduced by Nestle, but at the same time, it's cannibalizing the coffee business of Nestle. Nestle, the major business of Nestle 30 years ago was instant coffee, Nescafe, and the development of the Nespresso business model cannibalized the Nescafe business. New business models tend to conflict with the established business models. They can cannibalize it. They can undermine the established distributions of the established players. They have cultural conflicts, incentive conflicts, a variety of things that make them very, very difficult for established firms to either develop them, or even if they develop them, to actually implement them next to the core business and so on. So we have another session where we talk about the characteristics of business models and why are these characteristics of interest. And they are of interest in the course that I teach because they make them really, really difficult for established firms to either develop them or respond to them. So after we talk about, sorry, Julia, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, so I wonder, so what is your advice to these students that will most probably work for established firms afterwards?
Okay.
And how should they react?
So we come to the meat of the matter. The meat of the course is all about, okay, you've told us about the phenomenon and the characteristics of the new phenomenon and so on, but at the end of the day, I'm a big established firm. My industry is being attacked by these new business models. What do I do? So we come to, I would say 60% of my course over a semester is on the issues of how do I respond, let's say, to the new business model. Now, you may have noticed that because I look at it from the perspective of the established firms, I don't very much talk a lot about how do you develop a new business model, because for most established firms, that is not really a key strategic issue. How do I develop a new business model? All of these established firms, they already have a business model. They're already competing with a business model. So they're not sitting there saying, oh, I need to develop a new business model. Their big challenge is really, oh my God, somebody has just come in with a new business model. Is eating away my market. I can see their business model growing at my expense. What do I do to respond? So I have a series of sessions where we look at a variety of response. Every session is a different response. For example, one possible response for the established firm is to say, okay, I'm going to adopt the new business model. But adopting the new business model raises the issue of how do I compete with two business models at the same time? Because usually they don't abandon their established business model. They have the established business model in the core business. And at the same time, they say, how do I develop the new business model next to it? So we have a whole session raising the issues of, how do you play two games at the same time? Another possible response is to say, okay, I see the new business model, I see the advantages of the new business model, but I still would like to focus on my business model. Therefore, the question is, how do I improve whatever I'm doing with my business model, usually by taking elements of the new business model and incorporating them into my business model to compete against that one. If you look at British Airways, and the way it's competing against EasyJet or Ryanair in the low-cost market here, they did not adopt, the business model of EasyJet. But what they did, they adopted various elements of that business model into their existing business model to differentiate themselves relative to that. So the issue there is, okay, what is it that I borrow from the new business model to improve mine? How do I make the new business model not good enough relative to mine? Because if you remember, Clay Christensen always used to say that it's only when the new thing becomes good enough to mine that the customers switch. So one response you may have is, how can I differentiate whatever I'm doing even more so that the consumer looks at whatever I'm offering and says the alternative business model is not good enough relative to what the established player is offering to me. Another possible response that I tackle in a different session is the disruptor response, which is, remember, what did I say? One response is you adopt a new business model. So how do you play two games at the same time? Another is you focus on your business model and you try to differentiate it relative to the business model of the invaded you. Another one is to say, okay, I'm playing game A. They attack me with game B. I could counterattack them with game C. So we got into this element, okay, what exactly is this idea of disrupt the disruptor? How do you develop a new business model that disrupts the original disruptive business model? How do you develop it next to the core business, which raises the issues of how do you compete with two business models at the same time and so on. So we covered those issues as well. There are a variety of other possibilities here that you can talk about, but really, the message that I try to communicate to the students is that responding doesn't mean you have to necessarily adopt the new business model. It's not like the new business model is predetermined to come and conquer the whole market. It's not like the good Lord said, let the new business model win and so on. There are ways for the established player, to respond by not adopting the new business model and trying to slow its growth or grow its own business in a way, you know, that benefits it and so on. So, I mean, I can talk more about this, all these things, but you said, how do you cover a semester-long topic like business model innovation? I am focusing on a different question for every session. And when I look at it from the established players' point of view, there are many, many issues that business model innovation raises for the established firm. And I try, you know, every session is a different issue that I try to cover.
Great. Thank you, Kostas. So this was, I think, a good setup. Maybe you can mention specific cases that you use for this established firm perspective in your course.
Okay. Yeah. Another thing, I don't like to use long cases. What I've done is I've written my own mini cases, let's say, on companies that I know or I've studied. So, for example, I have a mini case or Nestle and Nespresso. I have another one where Medtronic, the medical device manufacturer based in Minnesota, developed a new business model called Niamet. You know, and they are competing in that business. So I developed a mini little case on that. You know, so I don't use, you know, the Harvard type long cases. I use short little cases that I wrote, and I use videos. You know, there are lots of videos now available where the CEO, let's say, of a company talks about their business for 5-10 minutes. So I will use that in the classroom as a basis, as a platform to then generate discussion with the students and so on. And I mean, later on, when we talk about the tools and so on, I can talk a little bit about some of the more experiential things that, you know, we do with the students. You know, in the developing of business models and playing two games at the same time. For example, we talk a lot about, you know, experimentation as a way of either developing a new business model, but also learning whether a new business model that you develop, is it any good? How can I sell it to my organization so that they say, yes, let's run with it and so on. So we have a session on experimentation, and, you know, we do a variety of experiential things to teach experimentation and the problems with experimentation when it comes to business models with the students, for the students. So, for example, I use the video of Rent the Runway that I'm sure all of you are familiar with the case of renting clothes as opposed to selling clothes for women and so on. So, you know, when we talk a little bit about how the people who developed the two ladies at Harvard Business School who developed the business model of Rent the Runway, how did they experiment with the various elements of the business model over time, and what can we learn from their experimentation and so on. So, you know, again, my emphasis there is I focus every session on a particular question that a student may be asking, like, how can I experiment with a business model in a clever way? You know, because experimenting with business models is different from experimenting with a new product. You know, we're talking about the whole business model. How do you experiment with a business model to learn, to validate the business model, to improve the one that you dreamt up in your office and so on, and then convince people around you in your organization that, hey, this is a viable business model, maybe you should run with it. So,
on that note, Kostas, we need to move on.
Okay.
In the spirit of giving everyone 15 minutes. So at this point, thank you very much. I learned a lot from you. I appreciate it. Let me now move to interview Julia. Those of you who joined us a little late, Julia is an associate professor at the Toulouse Business School in Toulouse, France. And Julia, could you start by sharing with us the learning objectives of the business model course you teach? Who is the audience and what are the learning objectives?
Okay, great. So thank you, Rafi. Thank you, Kostas, for your interesting course. My course is different. So it's different in several ways. So I have been teaching this 15-hour course on new business models to master degree students that have very little professional experience and that are 22-year-old students that just finished their undergrad and do a master in the French business school. So I teach this course to entrepreneurship and consulting master students in both virtual, physical, and hybrid formats the last year. And my course is more about the other side, the side of the entrepreneurs who develop the new business models, so the opposite of what Kostas has been talking about so far. My course is organized around team projects. Every team works on a company that I assign to them using the list of the latest unicorns coming from CB Insights, for instance. The focus is to analyze innovative startup that has received significant funding, is valued around $1 billion. That is the definition of the unicorn. And it is not yet a public company. So I choose companies that have functioning, innovative business models that they are attempting to scale. So the objective for my course, the learning idea, is for students to learn to evaluate existing innovative business models rather than design them from scratch. So the rationale for the course is to provide, first of all, practical business modeling tools for these students, as well as exemplars of inspiring novel cases in different industries. So this relates to research I have been doing with Chris Zott, for instance, that business model innovation is stimulated by business models from other industries than your own. So it is useful for people who are going to work on business model innovation in the future to have broad knowledge of different innovative business models across different industries. And another finding from our research is that it is important to develop a complex thinking style. And so that's also something I try to do in my course by giving students a lot of different tools, but also discussing different issues such as imitation, regulation, stakeholders involved, discussing different classic innovation pitfalls, let's say, for business model innovators, so that they're aware of these issues. So my course organization, well, I spent the first part of the course zooming in into the specific business model of the startup. And the second part of the course, we zoom out looking at the firm's ecosystem, looking at competitors, at regulators, at the environment. So I will share one slide here with the specific tools that I use. I think this will be probably useful as we had many questions about tools. You should be seeing my slides, I think. So is this working? Should be working.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Sorry, my computer is a little slow. It doesn't respond well to having Zoom and so many other things going on. So the business model tools, in the first part of the course, I start with the first thing for me is the jobs to be done, and this is the framework I use from Christensen. Kostas also mentioned Christensen's work that is very related to this business model discussion. So we examine with students what jobs to be done the company they are studying is. What are the jobs to be done that are sold? And then we focus on the value proposition. So the jobs to be done very nicely leads to this question of what is the value proposition to the customers? And then we zoom out a little bit more to the larger business model canvas. So this is developed by Osterwalder and colleagues. Probably everyone is familiar with this tool in this business model class, where we focus also on partners and revenue models. Again, apply to the specific startup that different teams are working on. We discuss other visualization tools, such as activity systems by Rafi and Chris. We also talk about the business model navigator that was developed by Gassman, where there are different patterns of business models that are shown that are sometimes interesting. Something else that I have added in the recent years to my class is our tools from the sustainability world. And this is something that undergraduate and master students are pushing for more and more today. So I, for instance, show the flourishing canvas developed by researchers interested in sustainability, where there's not only economic value, but also societal and environmental value that is considered in the value proposition part, for example. So then the second part of my course, we zoom out a little bit and we start talking about growing, so scaling. So how do these unicorns scale? And often this is related to questions about platforms. Many of new business models we see are platforms. And so in this course, I start discussing also network effects, which are big part of the growth of the unicorn. So probably 70% of the cases are platforms right now of the unicorn companies, if not more. And so we discuss these questions about why some companies can scale locally or regionally or internationally in these unicorns. And we then also use tools, again, Kostas mentioned the disruptive innovation discussion, talking about the dynamics, how these newcomers can or not disrupt, whom are they disrupting? Often we realize that they try to complement many players, not necessarily disrupt the whole industry. And we also use here the blue ocean strategy concept, particularly the value curve analysis. So this is something very useful for me in my course, for the students to realize that they're competitors to these innovators. And how do we compare them? Well, usually the value curve analysis in the blue ocean strategy is useful to line up different competitors in terms of different value types of propositions of value to the customers and compare them. And then the last part, well, we also focus on broader dynamics, on questions around competition, but also regulation. So the regulation can be a big problem or not for different business model innovators. So for example, I highlight the local nature of challenges. For instance, for Uber faces strong resistance, is banned in Germany and Korea, is very successful in the US. So what are the takeaways here for business model innovators is that their local relationships, for example, with regulators, that can be more or less problematic in different local settings, which poses interesting questions. Where should I grow? How quickly should I grow? How should I grow internationally if I am a startup that is trying to scale? So then the questions also posed by these issues are around this rhetoric of breaking rules that we have in the disruptive innovation that might work for some, like Uber, but might be a difficult proposition to sell, for instance, for European startups that want to break rules. And this can be harder in other settings. So finally, we also spent some time on the question of protection. And this is the last part of my course, where I ask my students, well, okay, these are great new business models, but can these be protected from imitation? Again, this collects to Kostas' point, established players, can they imitate? And the students realize, well, there are very few patents to protect a platform. There is no patent for software, either in US or Europe or Asia for that matter. So the questions about learning and speed, continuous innovation, experimentation, pivoting come up, and the students have, this is a learning point for them. Often they are a little bit unhappy because they learned that, well, we thought this is such a great company, but it might have problems going internationalizing in other countries because there might be imitators. So this is usually helps students to become aware of innovation costs and pitfalls, where the question of imitation is a big one. So at the end of the course.
So Julia, just on the issue of tools, do you use videos or short cases to illustrate the use of the tools in different contexts?
Yeah, so usually I spend relatively little time on the tool. So I present the tool and I usually have an example. So I discuss business model canvas and I show the business model canvas for Airbnb and I leave that on the board. And then I ask the students to work in their groups to apply that tool to their case. And usually then this application part is the most interesting one. So that's experiential learning happening there, where students start to figure out, okay, but we have two different types of customers. We have hosts, we have guests, so we should have the two value propositions. How should we do this? So let's say 30% of the course is me presenting tools and giving some examples, and then 60% is students trying to apply these tools to the specific case that they have throughout the class. So throughout all the sessions, they apply the different tools to the same company. And then at the end of the class, so I was coming to this last point, we have a round of presentations where each team presents their own company with its own business model and provides an opinion, evaluating this company. Do we think it will succeed or not in the future? And then we change our hats, let's say in the class, we say we are all investors, we are all venture capitalists, and we have these 10 presentations of different startups in different industries. So here, all students hear about different startups in different industries, and we try to choose the most exciting one, the one we think will conquer the world in the future. And this brings this last point in the class where students, they know about their company, but they also see others. So they get knowledge about different promising startups in different industries. And they get this also the change of the hats, trying to evaluate different startups, not only their own, at the end of the course. So I think to wrap up this a little bit, so different tools, I think they allow students to go a little bit more in depth with every step to understand the company, and to try to form an opinion to first of all understand why this startup is a unicorn, why they have been able to collect funds from investors for this maybe relatively simple idea. Second, students get exposed to different innovative cases from different industries that maybe they had no idea about. So then I focus on choosing cases from different industries. So industries such as fintech, education, retail, healthcare, connected to digitalization, where there are new customer needs and entrepreneurial ideas, how to fulfill these needs. Not sure my sharing works well. Try to share again my slide here. So some of the cases I use, I'm trying to move. So some of the cases I use are, for instance, French cases. So French cases such as Doctolib in healthcare, Back Market, which is a case of electronics refurbishing, US Ripple in fintech, US House, which is a company providing house design, or Swiss Coopel. So the idea for me here is to expose students to cases that they might be familiar with. So in France, for instance, Doctolib, everyone knows them, but also to expose them to cases in other countries that the students might not be familiar with. For instance, the Swiss Coopel that French people don't know at all about. And I think this is a useful tip for people teaching about entrepreneurial business models, is to have companies that people might have some idea about, but also others that they don't know at all. And this is useful for international faculty. We had some questions, for example, should we bring companies from other contexts? My advice is to have a mix of both local and international cases. And this stimulates a lot of discussion, because then we can ask, well, can the French Doctolib go to Germany? Can they go to US? Can the US House or Ripple come to France? What will be the consequences of that? And that brings interesting insights. I have also added recently some cases that are focused more on sustainability or circular economy. So the French startup that got a unicorn status this year is this Back Market that offers a platform for refurbishing electronics. So not to throw out mobile phones, but to repair them. And this is relatively popular with students, to have more cases that are focused on also sustainability goals and using tools such as Flourishing Business Model Canvas that I mentioned. So yeah, I mentioned that the class is balanced to 60% teamwork and probably 30% focused on tools, and then 10% spent on this really final presentation day that is an important day where we vote for different cases. Maybe last thing to mention is that I try to relate it to other disciplines. So for instance, resource-based viewing strategy, or the increasing importance of open innovation that they see in the innovation courses. But the main focus is this experiential learning about tools and about different innovative cases in different industries. So my last slide, I'll try again to share this. My sharing doesn't work very well for some reason. So the main takeaways so far, well, there can be different teaching objectives for the business model course. I think we have seen this with Costas, where this is established firm side. For me, this is more about evaluating existing business models of unicorns, of scaling startups. There is a very growing toolbox of business model innovation tools, so you can pick and choose. for whatever fits your course objective, for a course that is 3 hours or 10 hours or 30 hours, and all are possible. And in my opinion, it is useful, particularly in courses on business model innovation, to have several examples of novel startups that can stimulate imagination of the students to imagine future other possibilities, other kinds of mixes of business models in their industry, and to try to complexify their thinking. And this is not obvious, but I think in this world of business models, this is important to have a diversity of approaches, to see many different tools, and to ask many different questions during these courses. Yeah,
on that note, Julia,
here.
Thank you very much. It was very comprehensive. At this point, in the interest of time, let me introduce Christoph Dott, also known as Chris. Chris, raise your hand. Chris is a professor of entrepreneurship and chair of the Department of Entrepreneurship at the IESE Business School. Julia will now interview Chris. Thank you. And Julia, the floor is yours. Julia and Chris.
Thank you, Rafi. And hello, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Chris, again, I know you have a little bit different setup for your course. So another question from the audience was, how can we make students experience the development of a business model for a new business idea, how to do this most effectively in a limited time that we usually have for our courses?
Okay, first of all, great pleasure to be with you here. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I see we have now 105 participants. Wow, this is great. So thank you everybody for joining on a Saturday afternoon, morning. I see Kathy in California, so early, unbelievable. So it's great to have everybody here, and thank you so much for joining. Yeah, my course, I mean, what I'm going to talk about now is different. Will complement what Kostas and Julia have said in a nice way, I would say, because Kostas has talked about a course in which he is teaching, how to compete with new business models, established from an established firm perspective. Julia has talked about how to evaluate new business models using unicorns as a kind of as a baseline as inspiring examples. But none of them is talking about how to develop a new business model, and that's exactly what I'm doing in my course. I've designed a course. I'm offering this course at IESE to MBA students, which essentially teaches them how to develop a new business model for an established company. And I have a couple of slides where I would like to share with you a little bit the basic principles behind that course. And so can you see the screen, Julia? Is it okay?
Yes, everybody.
Okay. Working, very good. Okay. Okay, so the starting point obviously is the work that Rafi and I have done, and also Julia and the two of us have done over the years, which has culminated recently in this new book, which is called Business Model Innovation Strategy, that Rafi and I have published with Wiley. And that book is essentially meant as a teaching companion to help you with your courses in the MBA program, but also with executives. And it's structured in a modular way. It has got 12 chapters, and you can combine them in different ways. In fact, in my course, I'm running through all of the chapters essentially. But the essence of this book is that, business model innovation, this is our core hypothesis. Business model innovation is kind of a new perspective on innovation. It's a holistic perspective on how firms do business and how do firms do business in new ways. So it does not talk about product innovation. It does not talk about process innovation. It really kind of tries to focus on the system level view. And the emphasis is on activity systems. We define a business model as an activity system that is centered on a focal firm, but is possibly spanning firm and industry boundaries. And in regards to innovations, it's interesting in two ways, because number one, even if you still focus on products and product innovation, you still need a business model to unlock the value from product innovation. I have a case on an Israeli company that has a fabulous, fantastic, mind-boggling product innovation, but it fails to reap the rewards from their product innovation because it couldn't come up with the right business model. And so it's very important, even if you're just quote unquote a product innovator. And then of course the interesting thing is that can be a source of innovation in and of itself. What is a business model? Very briefly, it's basically the activity system. And in terms of the activity systems, there are 4 dimensions that are important: the content, which we refer to as the what dimension; the structure, which we refer to as the how dimension; the governance, who performs what activity; and then the value logic, which is how does this kind of activity system create value over and above what the product and the service does, and how does it allow, and why does it allow the focal firm and all the stakeholders to appropriate part of that value. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this definition, so I will not dwell on it. Inside this book, we're talking about these kind of 3 layers of business model innovation and business model innovation strategy. The central layer is obviously what I've talked about, the business model. But then comes the second layer, which is the how to design a new business model. And this is what I'll focus on. And then the outer layer, which is what I will not talk about, is what are the influences on the design, the strategic design drivers, or the antecedents of design. Julia has talked a little bit about it. For example, regulation, how does that constrain the design of a new business model? But in the interest of time, given that I only have a few minutes, I would like to focus on the second layer, which is the design phases. And this is in fact where which I use in order for my course as a basic process in the course. My course is on action learning, and I don't use mini cases. I didn't use videos. I didn't use Harvard Business School cases. I didn't use IESE cases. I use real cases. So in fact, what I do is I ask companies whether they have a business model challenge, existing companies. I ask them, are you under attack? Or do you see opportunities out there to develop a new business model? If so, we should talk. So I have this, I start kind of contacting companies about 4 months before the course starts. On LinkedIn, I publish a call for challenges. And on this slide, you can see some of the firms that participated in my course of the past 4 years. So you see some very well-known brands, Hewlett Packard, Seat, and so on and so forth. And so, with this kind of call for challenges, I'm addressing these companies, and I invite them, I encourage them to submit their projects to the course. And so typically I have these 2 or 3 different calls for challenges on LinkedIn, with like every month, like I start in September, then I have another call in October, then I have another call in November. And that typically results in about, a good dozen or more proposals, or 20 proposals that I then vet, and from which I select a handful, essentially. And in order to get these good proposals, I need to think about a good value proposition. We're talking about business model innovation, so obviously we need to apply what we preach and what we try to teach. So my value proposition to the project sponsors, to these companies, is starting at the top, that they get an assessment of their current business model. This is what Julia's doing in her course. An unbiased outside perspective on their issues, which is very, very important for them, because many companies do have this kind of culture where they all have the same view on their business model, and nobody dares to ask the critical questions, and sometimes the naive questions, which could be the best questions. But of course, if you give this project into the hands of a student team that who has no prior involvement with the business, they can ask these questions, and it's very powerful. I also offer these companies, along with the students, to learn new concepts and tools, to learn business model thinking, to bring this into their own companies. And at the end of the day, importantly, not just to have this assessment of the current problem, but also concrete solution proposals on how they could move forward. And then sometimes some of these companies had even made job offers to my students because they got to know them during the project, they became comfortable with them. And so this is also like a recruiting platform for the company. So there are multiple benefits for the participating firms. And in general, they really like it a lot. The students like it too, because they get to work on these exciting new cases. And in terms of the process, just to give you a sense for the timeline, I'm sorry about the small print here, but essentially my course runs from end of January until end of April. So it's like a 3-month course, but I start recruiting projects already in the summer of the year before, and start vetting projects in November, end of November, for about 1 to 2 months to select really, really good projects. This is very important. I cannot accept any project into this course. I mean, there are many interesting projects in this world, many interesting strategic challenges, marketing challenges, but I really want to have companies that have a real business model problem, a real business model issue. And so, you know, in this process of getting back and forth with the companies and say, hey, you know, can you work out this issue a little bit better? They also get to understand the perspective of the course better. This kind of pre-communication before the course actually starts is very, very important to get everybody aligned, and everybody aligned around the objectives of the course, but also with respect to the mindset of, you know, what is a business model in the first place? You ask managers, what is a business model? And, you know, ask 10 managers, you come up with 10 different answers. And so in this kind of process of me talking to the companies about their problems, I explain to them what I think, you know, in our view of the business, or my view of the business model, and so that we have a unified definition and that we can compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. Then, you know, the selected companies, I probably have 6, 7 companies that get to present their projects to the students. So they pitch to the students, and the students then have to bid for the best projects. And so it's not assured that a project that I pre-selected is actually then selected by the students. There's always a risk that the students will not you know, like a particular project for one reason or another. But I want to leave it up to the student to take the projects that they would like to take and they would like to work on. This is very important because this project in the course takes place at the end of the MBA, which is where I need to make sure that the students are really, really motivated to work on these challenges. It's a very, very time-consuming course, and so they need to take ownership in these projects, and this doesn't happen if I assign projects to them. They have to select the projects, and the way I do this is the following. I have the students bid for the leadership of the projects that they like the best. So I have a team leader in each project, and the students bid for being a team leader in a project. But I don't, then it's not me who decides who's going to be the team leader. I leave this up to the companies, to the project sponsors. So the companies essentially get the CVs of the students and their motivation letters, and they select a team leader, which is very important too, because this ensures that the companies really buy into this process as well. They have a say. They're not just passive bystanders, but they're actively involved in this process. And once a team leader is chosen, that team leader then will have to recruit team members in a course session and build a team around the challenge for which she or he has been selected a leader. And then once these teams are formed, off they go and they work really hard in order to try to understand the problem that this company is facing. So team building process I talked about, so I'll skip this slide. Just if anybody has a question, I can come back to it. But essentially, the students then move into a period of about 4 weeks where they conduct extensive field work. That is, they perform interviews with key business model stakeholders.
3 minutes, Christoph, 3 minutes.
Yes, Rafi, no worries, no worries. Okay, so they do like stakeholder discovery. Essentially, the idea is for them to get to understand the problem really deeply, and possibly, and this has always worked, after 4 or 5 weeks of struggling with the problem, they reformulate the problem, they reframe the problem, and this typically yields in a aha, not just for the students, but also for the companies. And yeah, so at the end of the day, then I run them through the process that we describe in the book. Rafi is very familiar with this process, and it seems to work. Here are some statements from the participants, and not just the participants, but also the project sponsors, who in general are very happy. Of course, not every project will turn out to be a spectacular success. We all know that student teams dynamics can be negative, and so the important thing for you as an instructor in this course is to be a cheerleader and to make sure that everybody's constantly motivated and working happily on their projects, and to sense problems as they arise, and then to address those problems and help students not just with business model issues, but also with team dynamics, and very practical problems, for example, how to get access to interviews and the like. But this is essentially what I wanted to say. And if anybody is interested in this methodology that I talked about, please feel free to visit our website, which is https://www.bmistrategy.com. On this website, you can find answers to some of the questions that were submitted to you before this PDW, such as what cases to use. So we have a selection of cases that can be used in conjunction with each chapter of our book, interactive exercises, little videos, how to teach BMI to online audiences. We have different syllabi, so a lot of resources on this website. And with that, I stop.
Thank you, Chris. I see there's one clarifying question that Ajit has for you. So Ajit, can you unmute yourself, please, and ask Christoph the question you have quickly?
Thank you very much, Rafi. I was hearing Yulia that when she teaches, she uses some example of interdisciplinary subjects. So I wanted to know that, do you also use some business analytics techniques to assess or evaluate business model design or innovation?
That was a question to Julia.
Yeah, I can take that. So I use many tools, Ajit. So we start with the jobs to be done, and then we talk about the value proposition, and then the business model canvas, for example. Those mostly are qualitative tools. So they are asking about what the customer wants, and is the company delivering what the customer wants, and in what way. So then I think one of the maybe challenges, I think, in this business model world is about quantitative tools. And there was a question from other participants about, do we use quantitative tools? And I'm not sure I'm aware of specific quantitative tools. So maybe my co-panelists can address that. So both tools I'm aware of are qualitative evaluation of the business models. I'm not sure I'm answering exactly what you're asking, but.
Okay, thank you, Yulia. Maybe any other panelist or someone could answer this.
Ajit, we have time for additional questions, 40 minutes, but we have, and we'll give you the opportunity to ask, not to worry, but we have been at it now for about an hour. So our suggestion is to take an 8-minute break. Just stretch and have a cup of coffee. And our next speaker fall in 8 minutes, in other words, which will be at 9:10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Our speaker will be Kathleen Eisenhardt, also known as Cassie. Cassie is the Stanford Acherman MD professor and co-director of the Stanford Technology Venture Program at Stanford University. It's early in the morning for Kathy and for me right now. So let's have a 8-minute break, and at 9:10 Eastern Time, we will resume with Kathy being the speaker. I will interview Kathy. Following the session with Kathy, we'll open it up for all of you. I urge you to submit your questions, and our panelists will address them to the best of our respective abilities. You can type them into the chat line. You can raise your hand just like Ajit did using the reaction panel at the bottom of your screen. So let's take a quick break, and at 9:10, we will resume. So we have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes, we will resume. Kathy, you're on right next, and I take it that you have a PowerPoint. You can upload it in 5 minutes, okay?
Sounds good, Rafi.
Very good. Good morning.
Yeah, and I hope the sun will be up by then.
I know, it is
It's
what
early.
it is. Yeah,
All right, see you all soon.
yeah. I usually don't get up at 4:30 to do the Zoom sessions.
So you're out visiting your daughter, Rafi?
We will resume in 2 minutes.
such a good.
Are you ready, Kathy?
Yeah, let me do my share.
Okay. Okay, so I think it's 9:10 right now. Everybody, welcome back. As I said earlier, we are very pleased to have Kathy Eisenhardt with us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. So Kathy, let me start by asking you one overall question, and that is, how do you teach business model innovation at Stanford?
Okay, well, thank you, Rafi, and thanks to Rafi and Yulia and Chris for organizing this PDW, and thank you all for coming. So, good morning and good afternoon or whatever, as Rafi said. Business model innovation. Let me just talk a little bit what I do. Oops. That's interesting. Here we go. There's a little delay in the advance. Yeah, first of all, let me set the context. The teaching niche that I'm in, that I'm going to be talking about. I teach a master's class, kind of equivalent to basically being MBAs, about 60 students. They are between 22 to 27, 28 in age, and I teach business models as part of a strategy course. In that course, I'm a fairly theoretically oriented person, so we step through some of the core theories of strategy with an increasing market dynamism. So we start with the basics of 5 forces. We do resource-based view. We then take more of a game theoretic point of view. Then we use growth strategy and simple rules. And as we go through the course, it's going from more stable to more dynamic markets. In the 5th module, I do strategy in new markets, and that's where I introduce business models. Within the business models, within the strategy and nascent markets module, I do 3 sessions, 3 90-minute sessions. Just to step back, the course itself is case-based, although there is also a business simulation, so the students are competing against each other. And there's also that's the front part of the course. The back end of the course, there's a company paper. So it's really a 3-part course. The cases, which is the mainstay of the different classes, but then they're also competing, and they're also doing a focused deep dive in a particular company. Within the 5th module of the course, I do 3 90-minute sessions. I use linear air, Mary Trips's course. That's about legitimating your product, building a robust ecosystem. And I combine that with an HBR article that Roy McDonald and I just wrote. I then do 3D robotics, 3DR and DJI, which is a competition in drones. And there we focus on how do you develop a superior product and product market fit. And I use the Lean Startup article of Steve Blank. And then in the last session in this part of the course, it's actually the wrap session of the course. I do business models, look at effective business models. And I compare 3 models in online fashion: Stitch Fix, Poshmark, which is a marketplace, and Rent the Runway, which is a rental market. And the base article that I use is the Reinventing Your Business Model article. That's Johnson, Henning Klagerman, and Clay Christensen from HBR. Not my favorite article. It's an older article now, but it's a simple article, and that's what I want to do in this particular course because it's a one session, so I keep it simple. The core theme of this part of the course is that performance of the firm is a function of having a good product. That's a superior product in an objective sense, but also a legitimate product, a robust ecosystem of partners, and then an effective business model. So that's really the theme that's driving this particular part of the class. And again, as I said, it's also the last class of the quarter. Let me dive into the particular class. I focus on creating an effective business model, and I compare Stitch Fix, which, if you don't know it, is a company here in San Francisco that where you can go and essentially through artificial intelligence, Stitch Fix sends you a box every so often and tries to predict what clothing you're going to buy. Poshmark is a marketplace where you can upload your clothes from your closet or clothes that you make and sell them. And Rent the Runway is a rental, but they're all online fashion. In the prior modules and sessions, I've already gone through learnings, things like experimentation, A/B testing in specifics. We've also gone through things around cognitive processes. How do you think about competition, analogies? So we've already kind of gone through those. And so this third course, this third module is really just focused on the core concepts of business model. And there, rather than using business model canvas, which I think is more complicated, I just use the 3 concepts slightly tweaked of the Johnson et al. Business model article. Specifically, I focus on superior substitute value, and I use that term. It's actually customer value proposition, but I prefer substitutes because it ties back into, for example, the 5 forces model. So it makes the point that I think is really important in new markets, and often new business models are in new markets, that what your peers are doing is not nearly as important as the substitute that you're trying to be better than. So how, in fact, in online fashion, you're trying to be better from the usual retail experience. So superior substitute value. What is the core capability with the supporting activity system? So here I'm very, very close to Rafi and Chris in terms of emphasizing the activity system, but also a core capability. And this is how one creates value in the business model. And then I focus in on what are the profit, what are the unit economics, the profit logic, the profitable unit economics, which is really about value capture and revenue models, but also the broader question of cost. So I really focus on these 3 concepts: substitute value, core capability with activity system, and profitable unit economics. What do I do in the 90 minutes? I set up, first of all, that you can have distinct business models, but relatively similar products or services. So all my students, and I'm sure all of yours are familiar with Spotify, with Pandora, and Apple Music as ways to get online music, but as fundamentally different business models. I do Hulu and Netflix and little Uber and taxis. So they sort of get the idea that the business models can offer similar products and services, but be actually quite different. The class then focuses on the comparison of Stitch Fix with Poshmark, with Rent the Runway. Both Stitch Fix and Poshmark are now public companies. Rent the Runway, I don't think is yet, but it's a company that has been highly successful. I think what the idea that I'm comparing to 3 companies that most of the students know and many of the students have experience with helps ground the concept that's often too abstract of business models. So they can really say, oh yeah, how is Poshmark different from Stitch Fix, for example? And particularly we step through the comparison, the conceptual comparison. What is each a substitute for? For example, Stitch Fix is a substitute for a personal shopper at a department store. So a personal shopper at, for example, here, Nordstrom. How strong is the substitute? How big is the market? Poshmark is a substitute for a thrift store. We then discuss the critical core capability each has to build and how hard it is to build, how defensible that is. So for example, Stitch Fix, it's artificial intelligence, machine learning. At Rent the Runway, it's operational logistics of dry cleaning and managing an inventory. At Poshmark, it's around community engagement. We talk about how defensible that is, and then what else the activity system has to be for that business model to work. Then we take a look at what are the unit economics of each of these, how profitable are they, whether or not you have to, for example, carry inventory. And here we focus in on what are the key metrics for each of the business models. So for example, at Rent the Runway, it's turns per garment, or at Stitch Fix, it's percentage of items of a box that you receive that people keep. So the students start to really, I think this comparison is really a great way to sharpen up how on the key dimensions, business models, despite being somewhat similar, are actually quite different from each other. And then I asked the students to discuss which is the superior business model. In preparation for the class, they've all worked in teams, and so they've all prepped all of these questions, and I'm mostly guiding the discussion at this point. I then, in the wrap up to the class, I sort of discussed the fact that each of these business models has pros and cons related to things like how defensible it is, how asset intensive it is. But then I make the sort of the big point is, but they're all successful models. These are all successful companies. I then wrap up and talk about a study that Ron Tidhar, Ben Hallen, and I have written a paper on, because each of these firms also has what we call the evil twin, which is a company that started in the same space that's tried to do the same thing. For example, tried to predict what people wanted, like Stitch Fix did. So we have a firm that really succeeded, and one that was usually pretty good but didn't succeed. And then that really lets us contrast both what you have to do within the business model to be successful, but also show that each of the better firms followed the same process. And what each of them did was begin with a relatively slow development and learning of a simple core transaction and not focus on growth, as opposed to the evil twins that all focused on growth and focused on product market fit. And then once each of these more successful firms figures out the core transaction, they then build the core capability in the activity system. And we also note that one of the keys is hiring elite talent and having superior data science, and then they scale. So the pitch is, on the one hand, during the class, how ostensibly similar products can have very different business models, and then show that developing the business model has the same process that they're all following, and why that makes sense. Why you need the core transaction before you grow, why you need to build the defensible capability and the complete activity system. So that's what I do. And I do have some background research for those of you who are into background research. Paper of Roy and mine and ASQ on parallel play, decision weaving, Tim Ott and I, and then revenue models, and then this model this paper that actually is comparing forming a business model. So that's what I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. It's very interesting. We are now at a point. Do you want to say a few more words before I move to the next part of our Q&A session? At this point, we'd like to open it up for your questions. There were many questions that were submitted. And what I'd like to do perhaps is get this question and answer section of our PDW going by asking Chris a question that was one of the questions that were submitted, and perhaps we need to elaborate a little bit more on. And I don't know who among you submitted that question, but the question reads, how to introduce the activity system perspective on business model when you teach? So Chris, since you addressed that issue in your course, perhaps you can elaborate on how you introduce that perspective.
Sure. Let me just say thanks to Kathy. I really enjoyed the talk. Also, before I talk about the activity system, wanted to mention that I think one thing that ties all the presentations together is that all of us who have introduced our way of teaching business model innovation favor a very strong link back to research. So it has become very clear from Kathy's presentation that there is a very strong research base for her teaching, and I think that's very important. I think that's what everybody should do as well. Use very strong research foundations. And as to the activity system perspective, obviously, I'm using kind of our ideas, Rafi. But the way to teach it and the way to bring it across, I think I do it like Kathy. Kathy mentions that she's comparing these different companies like Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music, or Uber and Taxi, who at the end of the day deliver a very similar service or a very similar product, but using a very different backdrop in terms of the activities that they run through while delivering that service. I do the same thing. So for example, I come in and use the example of peer-to-peer lending, a company called Zopa or a company called Prosper, which is perhaps better known in the United States. And then I say, what is the product of these companies? And it's, in fact, it's a loan product. It's very, very similar, indistinguishable from what a bank does. But then I show how, the activities behind that, behind the Zopa financial service or the Prosper financial service, and how that activity system differs from the bank. And I think that brings across the point quite effectively, so that students understand it's really not about the product, but it's about the how to do business.
Thank you, Chris.
I can maybe add to that. In my course, well, I start with, as I said, with the customer, the value proposition, and then the business model canvas. And then I ask the students, is the business model canvas the best way to present your business model? And we discuss that maybe this is not the most exciting way to present how you do business. You can have other alternatives. Which brings us to questions of interactions and what the company does, and showing it in a different way, which is an activity system perspective. So then I follow up the session on business model canvas with this activity system view that provides, in a sense, a more dynamic way to show what the company does that is different and in positive ways, useful to visualize the activity systems of the company. So usually for my students, the one takeaway is that they like to have the business model canvas because they expect to learn that from the business model class, but then the activity system is a different way to see it and usually helps them to even better understand what the company does. So I use both.
Okay,
can I just say something? Based on the 4 presentations we've had, I think a message that I'd like to communicate to our audience is that we started out by saying, how do you teach business model innovation? And there is no answer to that question, because we have to think specifically what questions within business model innovation are you trying to answer? So for example, Chris focused a lot on the question of how do you design and develop a new business model? That's his whole course. So I think Julia, you said, I spent a lot of time trying to answer the question of how do you assess a successful unicorn business model and so on. Kathy talked a lot about the elements of a superior business model by comparing firms offering basically the same product but through a different business model. I look at established firms and how do you respond to business models. So there's no one thing like, you cannot just say, I'm going to teach business model innovation. You have to be clear what kind of question within business model innovation you're trying to teach an answer to the students.
Kostas, if you are not speaking, please mute yourself, because there are some other noises that we hear and we'd like to hear the speaker usually. So we urge you to post questions on chat, and we will call on you as soon as we see the question. So there's one question here that came up. Please enlighten me on business analytics techniques used in business model design. So any one of our panelists who wishes to take that question. I don't know who the question came from, it doesn't show, but perhaps we can address that.
I can say a little bit about that and then let others jump in.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I emphasize to the students is that different models have different analytics. So the analytics, for example, for the Rent the Runway business model are largely around how often you turn a particular dark garments. So you do get like 10 wears out of it, or 20 wears, or 5 wears. So that tends to be one of the key metrics. In contrast, if you're looking at a predictive analytic, your predictive model like Stitch Fix, where Stitch Fix tries to predict what clothes a buyer like myself wants, and sends me a box, and then I choose to buy or not. The key analytic is around the percentage of the items in the box that the consumer buys because of the expense of the shipping, among other things, as well as the opportunity cost. So I emphasize not so much a one size fits all metric, but rather having the students start to think through the profit levers and the growth levers of each of the business models and what you really have to get right in the business model. And so I take more that point of view. And I'm not sure where my video went, but anyway, so so I don't think there's a one size fits all metric. I think rather the key thing for the students is to understand that metrics vary depending on the business.
Very good. Anybody else wants to add something before we go to the next question? That
Sure. Let me just take a different spin on this question of analytic, because I would like to offer a process analytic, and a very simple one, because sometimes we tend to overcomplicate things and maybe try to collect too many data and try to analyze them in too complex ways, or very complex ways, in sophisticated ways. But what I have found very effective is to focus on a very simple analytical tool in the process of designing a new business model, which I call the problem statement. And then to use a second, so the problem statement is to try to formulate the business model problem a company is facing in a simple statement, and formulate it from the company, not from the company's point of view, but from the kind of a market participant's point of view, like a customer point of view. And then the second analytical tool that the students can use in order to develop this problem statement and to bring it to the next level is simple interviewing and powerful interviewing techniques that many of us also use for qualitative research. And I try to teach my students the power of qualitative research when addressing real world problems and not just research problems. Qualitative methods can be extremely powerful, both in research, but also in practice.
Thank you, Chris. So again, we encourage you to post questions. I'd like to go to another question that was submitted in advance, and that is how to provide constructive feedback on business models generated by students when these models are really not validated. So how do you engage students yet provide them valuable constructive feedback? That's a question that sometimes in different contexts, as instructors, we always face. You don't want to discourage people, but you also want to give them realistic, honest, constructive feedback. So in the context of business model innovation, how does one do that? That's a question that came up, one of the first long questions. And I think that's something that we should discuss.
Try to answer it, Rafi. I don't do that, by the way, because I don't teach new business model design to students, so I don't have to. But if I were facing a situation like that, first of all, before I give feedback to the student, I will try to make it less personal. Instead of giving feedback on their business model, I will pick one or two other business models, well-known business models, and go through an intellectual exercise with the student as to how would you evaluate whether this business model is good or bad. For example, Kathy just gave us some criteria that she uses, for example, for the students to compare. And once the student evaluates other business models and along certain criteria, then I'll say, use the same criteria now to evaluate your own business model. So at the end of the day, the student themselves will have to decide whether their business models are good or not based on what I told them, but based on the criteria that we develop, that they evaluated other business models and then they use them to evaluate their own business model. But I don't know if any of my co-hosts here have any alternative approaches to this question.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience on these issues, on this particular issue, I try to give them comments, but I say, look, think about this alternative. I like for them to realize for themselves whether there are other ways that perhaps could be equally or better suited to the situation. So I try to expand their horizon rather than saying, "It's a good job. Did you do this? Did you do that?" I say, "Yeah, we can do that. But what about another way? What about a third way? Let's think about it together." So what I'm trying to do when I'm doing these things, you have to be quick on your feet to some extent, but you have to engage them in broadening their horizon, and then for themselves to see, yeah, I could have done a better job on this dimension or in another dimension. And that's kind of a little risky because I don't know what's coming my way, and I have to come up with some alternatives on the spot. But for me, it has always worked because people like to take ownership of their ideas, and I just channel them to think a little bit differently, and then they come up with a better solution usually. So that's one way that I deal with this particular question.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit to that. So I'm very much with Kostas on this idea of giving tools and saying, following the same procedures we did in class to their own model. I think for me, the useful part to tell students is to think about competitors and substitutes. And usually when they have a new idea for a new business model, there's no one else in the world that has that idea, or that's their assumption. So I usually ask them to find specific competitors or substitutes, and then do a comparison between what the competitors do and what they could do. And that usually already is a good first step to get this opening the horizon process going, let's say.
So another question that came up is how to integrate into a business model innovation course, social impact, environmental aspect, environmental dimensions, and how do they affect the financial performance of the business model? So anyone who wants to address that issue?
Well, I can take a first stab at it. I mean, as I tried to explain, the way I look at the business model is pretty much a holistic view of the activity system, but not just of the activity system of the firm, but also activities that are performed by stakeholders, even by customers. So it's basically, this type of perspective expands the horizon away from a focal firm to really include stakeholders that are not part of the focal firm. And by engaging, or by encouraging the students to engage in a stakeholder discovery process, they begin to understand, the important perspectives outside of the focal firm and take them into account. And so I think it's embedded in the process that they take this wider perspective, and that they take these non-financial issues also into consideration, because it's just part of the process of questioning and trying to understand the problem. Also, let me say one more thing about the feedback question, Rafi, that you asked a little earlier, which is where I wanted to say that, I match, for example, student teams and let them give feedback to each other. I think feedback is absolutely critical. And when I challenge them, I don't challenge them on the ideas and the solutions that they come up with, but I challenge the students on their understanding of the problem. Because students tend to see the problem, first of all, from the company's point of view. And I encourage them to really take a perspective which is different from the company whose problem they're solving, to come up with a better and a deeper understanding of the problem. And for that, they need some pushing and some critical feedback. I know that I have derailed you a little bit, Rafi, because this is going back to the feedback question, but please ignore my feedback remarks and get back to all the other panelists, to the stakeholder, to the stakeholder question.
Yeah.
I mean, I can take a bit more of the sustainability or social concerns question. So in my case, I integrate some cases that are more sustainability or socially focused on solving problems that are specifically related to those issues. And over time, I have, like in student feedback, there has been a lot of push towards seeing startups or cases that are more engaged, let's say, with environmental or social concerns. And yeah, so I moved from 10 very classic economic startups to now I have 8, 9 that are more classic, and I added 1 or 2 that are, for instance, one that is focused on not selling new electronics, but selling refurbished electronics. And then this comes up also in the question about value proposition, or what do customers want? And more the new needs of customers are also related to products that are produced in ways that are traceable, products that minimize waste, etc. But this also relates to the business model overall. How do you structure your business model to do that? Particularly if you're a new firm and need also to pay attention to cost, etc. So that so introducing these more circular, sustainable cases helps then to respond to those questions and analyze them together with students.
Thank you, Julia. There is a question that came to us from Natalia Makuha. Natalia, the floor is yours. Please ask your question. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. I am interested in what are predecessors for business model innovation course? What subjects, what courses must be pre this course, business model innovation?
You mean the predecessors to business model innovation? What other courses should prepare people to take that course?
Be previous, what courses should be previous?
I see.
Yeah, I can say something about that. I think, I don't know that it has to be courses, but certainly concepts. I think that students really do need to have some understanding of something like a 5 forces model, so basic understanding of industry dynamics, particularly the difference between peers, rivals versus substitutes. I think a resource-based view is really useful to have also seen. So I think some sort of basic strategy, whether it comes within the course, which is what I do, or whether it comes from a separate course, but sort of the core ideas, the ideas that come out of something like simple rules and growth strategy around learning. So I think those are probably the keys: resource-based view, 5 forces, and something around learning, experimentation, and conceptual models. And whether that comes within the course or whether that comes in a prior course, I don't think matters, but I think those are the concepts one needs to know to really then get into business models.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Rafi, can I also say?
Yeah, sure.
Just very quickly. I mean, it's the predecessors for a BMI course. I come back to what Kostas has said earlier. Kostas has said, we can teach like 5, 6, 7 different BMI courses. They will all be different depending on what you want to teach. So, it depends on what course you want to teach. And so, for my course, where I want to teach them how to develop a new business model, what I have found very useful, besides, the students having a good understanding, a solid understanding of strategy, but what I have found really, really useful is if they have a very good understanding of how to go out of the classroom and how to talk to normal people and how to ask effective questions. And how to set up interviews, how to be nice, how to get an appointment, very basic stuff, because sometimes they're very lost with those very simple things. And so, for example, I once had exchange students from the University of Michigan in my class. They all had done a design thinking course where they had done some projects where they had to interview people previously. And in my course, they did really well because they didn't struggle with, those very basic things.
Very good, Chris.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question here from Dr. Faisal Saeed Malik. Dr. Faisal, could you please ask your question?
Hello to everyone. Thanks for these insightful thoughts. My question is do you consider contingency planning against exogenous shocks as part of business model innovation? because as you know, like after COVID, that the whole business canvas or business environment has changed in different parts of the world. So can you please talk about that?
Yeah, I actually do it in the part of my, because I teach business models in strategies in nascent markets. I don't do it in the business model class, but I do the linear air case, which is a case where it's a commuter airline, and what happens in that case is there's a major financial disruption, and so I show the value of having a redundant ecosystem. So around where the key uncertainties are, have multiple ways you could accomplish that particular task. So I bring it in part of how you operate in a new market, which tends to also be one that can be destabilized. With regard to COVID, I don't know that anybody predicted quite anything as extreme as COVID. So that was a little hard to plan for, but the general idea of robustness, I definitely bring in.
If I could add to Kathy's point there, I mean, at the end of the day, any course on business model innovation is a course on innovation, you know, and the question is, how do people come up with new ideas? And one source of new ideas will be disruptions in the environment, exogenous shocks. That's what creates opportunities. So it's impossible to consider a course on business model innovation without considering exogenous shocks. You have to sit there and say, okay, what technological, but not only technological, but what disruptions are happening out there, be they technological or you know, socio-political or economic, macroeconomic, or even health related like COVID. What kind of shocks are happening out there? What new opportunities do they create for us to either exploit with traditional business models or with a new business model? So in designing a new business model, you should definitely consider exogenous shocks.
Thank you. Another question that was submitted prior to the beginning of our PDW is what kind of small interactive in-class exercises can be implemented when teaching BMI? So if there are any ideas on, and I guess this relates to how do you engage students during the class in giving them a business model mindset, if you will.
Yeah.
Away from a product mindset or process mindset.
Yeah. Well, just one idea from me, Rafi. I mean, one of the elements that one of the things that I try to teach in my course is the importance of experimentation, you know, and especially experimentation of new business models. And you know, you can talk about it and you can give people examples of how innovations happen through experimentation and so on and so forth. But I found this game, I mean, some of you probably already know about it. It's called stick or switch. It's a quite famous business problem where, you know, basically, if you Google it, stick or switch, that's what it is. It's a beautiful game. Basically, you ask the students, there are 3 doors. Behind one door, there is a lot of gold. Behind the other 2 doors, there is goats, and you know, anyway. So basically, you do that in class for about 5 minutes, and everybody messes it up. Everybody, and then you put them into an experiment. You ask them to experiment with the thing, and when they come back after 10-15 minutes, they all get the right answer. Why? Because through experimentation, the answer is revealed and so on. Anyway, it's a beautiful little exercise, really, to show to these students that, look, you may be smart, you may think you know everything about it and so on, but at the end of the day, you know, nothing competes with data. Data is king or queen. If you really want to convince people about something or see the light, run a simple experiment. And so it's a little exercise that I use to impress upon the students the importance of experimentation. And once we do that, then we get into debate of, okay, what is a good experiment versus a bad experiment, and how do you run an experiment which involves business model as opposed to products and so on and so forth. But anyway, if you found what I just said interesting, just Google stick or switch, and there's beautiful material on this exercise that you can use in your classroom. Okay, I've been asked to type the thing in the chat box. Obviously, my accent is not there yet, John. Stick or switch? It's my accent.
Chris, you want to add to this question about in-class exercises?
Yeah, I use exercises, short exercises between 10, 20 minutes, just to break up also the classroom and, to change the dynamics from time to time. So first class, for example, I use an exercise where I ask the students, when I introduce the basic concept of the business model, the activity system perspective, the different dimensions, and the difference between product innovation and business model innovation, I ask them to think about, put them into small teams and ask them to think about interesting recent business model innovations that they have come across, and then to help us, to dive deep and understand and explain where does the innovation lie, on which dimension, on the what dimension, the how dimension, the who or the why dimension, and that gets them to really kind of capture and understand the deep distinction between product innovation and business model innovation. And along those lines, I've developed exercises for each chapter of the book that I mentioned a little earlier. And everybody who's interested in, who adopts the book for their courses will get access to these exercises. I'm very happy to share them.
So another question that was asked, and that is, how do you gain legitimacy as a teacher of business model innovation without practical experience? So
I have a quick answer to that.
Yes.
Writing a paper like Kathy and Costas and Julia, or writing a book. That helps.
What I do, Rafi, what I do a lot, I mean, let's face it, most of us have never worked in our lives. We are professors, but have never really been. So the problem of not having practical experience with business model innovation is not unique to business model innovation. It's with everything we teach. We don't really have practical. So what I do, I bring lots of business model innovators into my classroom. Usually they are young kids, these guys. They're 25, 26, 27-year-olds. They come in and they talk about their business model to the students and so on. And, you gain credibility through association with people that have innovated. That's one way.
Very good. Another question.
Rafi, here's another one. I mean, seriously, even those of you who have not published papers and books and stuff on business models, but if you run a project which has a few cases, real life cases, that will really serve you well, because then you can say, we've done cases for real companies and we've delivered some results, and you can build on this, and it will be a great source of legitimacy for, the next course or the next sessions you teach on business models. So just a few live cases, and if it's just only one or two student projects that you do, you already claim that you have worked on real cases, and so that will give you credibility.
Yeah.
Can I sorry,
yeah.
can I
Sure.
come in and say,
Go ahead.
hi guys. One of the points, when I get this question, I usually also say, listen, when you go to the doctor, most doctors have never experienced the diseases that they're trying to treat. Right? But the point is they understand the theory of the diseases and they understand the practice of it as well, actually, but without having experienced it, right? So
that's a good one. Does it
work, Christian? Does it work for you?
Yeah. Well,
yeah. So we have another 5 minutes left. Let me one more question that stood out here, and that came from an emerging market faculty, and asked whether there are special consideration when teaching business model innovation in the context of emerging markets. Any comments on that? The ecosystem might not be fully developed. There might be other challenges. So reflections on that question, I think, would be helpful to the person who asked that question, that evidently comes from an emerging market. So
yeah, Rafi, very quickly, I'm mentoring an entrepreneur in India who's running very large-scale projects in digital transformation of the last mile health health services, and essentially developing telemedicine business models, you know, kind of educational online universities for certain academia in India. And what I can tell you is that the basic principles that we together, you know, all of us, you know, who are here in this session have developed and have unearthed seem to work also in these more challenging settings. Obviously, we have to pay attention to the specific conditions. And so, for example, experimentation, you know, in certain ways goes easier because you can run very interesting experiments, large-scale experiments in those countries. And so basic principles apply, but with caveats. You have to be, you have to make many more assumptions, let's say, that you then have to test. But the ideas of testing and running experiments remain the same and remain valid.
Right. So any other comment from any other participant?
I mean, I have a similar reaction to what Chris is saying. I think many of the tools apply. So the value proposition or jobs to be done, well, maybe jobs to be done will be different, but there will still be needs of customers that need to be explored and well understood by the company. So there is some kind of universal approach of these tools that should theoretically work, while institutions will work differently. So the regulatory environment will have to be understood well, but that's also the case in developed markets. So you have to understand well what the regulation is and to which extent you can push it or not push it or complement it, etc. So the ideas about disruptive innovation, for instance, still will be there and should be potentially useful to analyze in a different context. So for me, that would be a different context, but still most tools, I don't see why they wouldn't apply. But if there are boundary conditions, that's a great research article.
So we're just about out of time. So I'd like to just use 2 minutes to summarize. And I think there are numerous takeaways from this session, including, but not limited to, the fact that different aspects of business model innovations can be highlighted depending on whether the course is business model innovation is one module in a strategy class, whether it's a standalone course, and if it's a standalone course, what are you focusing on? Are you focusing on evaluating business models, such as Julia? Are you focusing on the design of business models? Are you of innovative or novel business model? Are you focused on the implementation of business model? So depending on the goals and the focus and the length of time, and obviously the audience that you're teaching, different highlights of the business model innovation process and content should be highlighted. We hope that by this PDW, we are at the beginning of developing a community of faculty who are interested in this topic. As Chris has mentioned, we developed a website, bmistrategy.com, and that has a lot of information about teaching business model innovation. We welcome interaction with all of us, with Cassie, with Kostas, with Julia, Chris, and myself. For any additional questions that you might have, I think that this domain of business model innovation has emerged with the development of information technology, the internet, and we see new forms of innovation of how to do business, even of companies that produce very, very similar products. As Cassie has mentioned, that is one way to show the role and importance of business model in creating and capturing knowledge. So on behalf of Cassie, Kostas, Julia, Chris, and myself, thank you everyone for participating in our PDW, and all the very best to you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.